She was 70 years old the morning the letter arrived, and she read it standing at her kitchen counter in the pale yellow light of a November dawn, her reading glasses pushed up her nose, her coffee going cold beside her. The letter was not long. It did not need to be. What it said was this. The house she had rented for 31 years, the narrow two-bedroom on Clement Street with the cracked front step and the window that always stuck in August, was now hers. Paid in full. Deed enclosed. Her name was Cecile May Watkins. And she had no idea how that letter came to exist. She would find out. This is the story of how. If you have ever known someone who gave quietly and kept giving long after the world stopped watching, stay with us. This one is for you. Clement Street ran 6 blocks through the south end of a small Ohio city called Harlan, and it was not the kind of street that appeared on postcards. The sidewalks buckled where tree roots had been pushing up for decades with no one coming to fix them. The houses sat close together, narrow and tired, most of them rentals, a few of them falling behind on the upkeep that cities notice only when codes violations pile up. There was a corner store that had been a laundromat, and before that a barber shop, and before that something nobody could quite remember. There was a bus stop with a shelter whose plastic wall had been cracked for years. There were children. There were always children. Cecile had moved to Clement Street in 1993, the year she took a job teaching 4th grade at Harlan Elementary, 6 blocks east. She was 39 then, newly widowed, the mother of one grown daughter who had already moved to Atlanta, and she arrived with a car full of books and a box of math manipulatives she had purchased herself because the school did not have enough. She was not trying to plant roots on Clement Street. She was just trying to pay her rent. The roots came anyway. She was the kind of woman who noticed things. She noticed that the boy next door, a 9-year-old named Devon, sat on the porch every afternoon with a book open in his lap and a look on his face that was not concentration but the careful imitation of it, the look of a child who wants to appear to be reading while not quite understanding the words. She noticed that the 2 girls from the house at the corner, Amara and her little sister Bee, walked past her window every morning at 7:15 with their backpacks on, but no breakfast in them, and that Amara sometimes carried Bee on her back when Bee was slow. She noticed that the boys who gathered under the oak tree on summer evenings were not bad boys, but idle ones, and that idle in this neighbourhood meant something with weight. She invited Devon in that first September 1993 and sat with him at her kitchen table for 45 minutes, and by the end of it he had decoded a page of a chapter book on his own, and his face had changed the way faces change when something that was stuck comes unstuck. He came back the next day. He brought his cousin Marcus. Cecile had not advertised anything. She had not put a sign in the window or passed out flyers. She had simply opened her door on a Tuesday afternoon and left it open, and somehow every child on Clement Street understood what that meant. By October of 1993, she had 7 regulars sitting at her table or on her floor, working through whatever it was that school had not yet managed to give them. By the following spring, it was 14. She charged nothing. This point is not incidental. It was the whole architecture of the thing. The families on Clement Street were working families, service sector families, families where the rent was one unexpected car repair away from crisis, and Cecile understood what a price tag on her kitchen table would have meant. It would have meant shame. It would have meant the quietest children, the ones who needed the most, would never have come. So she charged nothing, and she told no one this was a sacrifice, because to her it was simply what you did. What you spent over the years was not nothing. By 1998, Cecile had retired from Harlan Elementary at the mandatory age, 65 being the district's suggestion and 55 being her body's clear preference. But she was not a woman built for stillness. She took on more children instead. Her pension covered her rent and her groceries and her electricity and not much else, and she spent a portion of it every month on supplies. Pencils, wide-ruled notebook paper, a set of flashcards that she laminated with a machine she kept on the kitchen counter. Later, a second-hand laptop. Later still, a second-hand printer and ink cartridges that cost more than she budgeted. The shortfall came out of other things. She ate simpler. She kept her thermostat at 65 in the winter and opened the windows in the summer and put a box fan in the living room doorway. She had been doing this for 11 years by 1993, plus 11 is 2004, for 22 years by 2015, for 31 years by the morning the letter came. In 31 years, she had worked with somewhere between 200 and 250 children. She did not keep a ledger. There was no wall of photographs, no scrapbook, no record. If you asked her how many children had sat at her table, she would think for a moment and say, "Lord, I couldn't tell you." And her eyes would go somewhere inward and she would smile. She remembered them by detail rather than by count. The boy with the stutter who read aloud every afternoon for 2 months until one day the stutter eased and he read a whole paragraph clean. The girl who came to her at 12 already convinced she was not a math person and left at 13 having passed the 8th grade placement exam. The twins whose mother worked nights and whose father was not present and who showed up some mornings still in yesterday's clothes, and Cecile would give them a bowl of oatmeal before they sat down to work. She did not speak of herself as a hero. If you told her she was, she would look at you with the composed, gently amused expression of a woman who has heard a thing said wrong but is too polite to correct it plainly. "I just have a table," she would say, "and some time." What she did not tell you was that the table had been bought second-hand in 1991, and she had been meaning to replace it for 15 years. What she did not tell you was that there were nights she added up the month's expenses in her head and felt the familiar tightening, the sense of an arithmetic problem with no good answer. She paid her rent on the 1st of every month, 31 years without a late payment, and she was proud of that in the quiet way she was proud of most things, which was to say, she did not mention it. The house on Clement Street was owned by a property management company. In 31 years, the company had changed names twice, been sold once, and raised her rent 4 times, each time with the legally required notice, and each time by an amount she had adjusted to, quietly, the way you adjust to a coat getting slowly too small. She had not in 31 years thought about owning the house. Ownership was not a category she placed herself in. You had what you had, and you were careful with it, and you were grateful. Now, let's go back 16 years. Back to 2008, when a 14-year-old named Darius first sat down at Cecile's kitchen table. Darius came from 2 houses down. His mother worked at the hospital as a dietary aide second shift, which meant she left the house at 2 in the afternoon and came home at 11 at night, and Darius had that stretch of hours to fill on his own. He was not a troubled child. He was, if anything, a very serious one. The kind of quiet that is not emptiness, but something closer to depth, a boy who watched more than he spoke and who, when he did speak, said the thing he meant without ornamentation. His grades were mediocre, not because he was not capable, but because the particular shape of his intelligence did not match the particular shape of the tests. He was an assembler of patterns. He could see how things connected before he could explain why they connected, which made multiple-choice questions a kind of torment and open-ended problems a kind of relief. Cecile saw this in him within 40 minutes. She shifted what she did with him. She stopped drilling and started asking. She gave him problems that required him to show his thinking rather than fill in a bubble, and she sat across from him and said, "Walk me through it. Tell me how you got there." And Darius, who had been performing dumbness for years to avoid the particular embarrassment of being wrong in public, found to his surprise that his thinking, when walked through out loud, was generally correct. He came to her 3 afternoons a week for 2 years. He was 16 when his school offered him a spot in an advanced mathematics track, the first in his family to place into it. He was 17 when he started working part-time at a small accounting firm downtown, filing and entering figures and watching how numbers organized the real world. He told Cecile about the job the day he got it, and she made him a cup of tea, and they sat at the kitchen table, and she said, "I knew you'd find your way in." He was 18 when he graduated, the first in his family to do so without a gap year spent waiting to figure something out. He left Harlan at 18, and Cecile did not hear from him directly for a long time after that, though she heard about him the way you hear about someone on a street like Clement, in pieces, through his mother, through his cousin Marcus, who still came around sometimes. She heard he had gone to college in Columbus on a partial scholarship and a Pell Grant and a job at a campus library. She heard he had changed his major twice before settling on finance. She heard he had graduated and taken a job in Cincinnati. And then the pieces came less often, the way pieces do when a life gathers velocity and moves out ahead of the neighborhood's ability to track it. Cecile kept tutoring. She kept buying pencils and notebook paper and ink cartridges. She kept eating simpler and keeping the thermostat at 65 and opening the windows in August. In the summer of 2019, Darius came back to Clement Street for the first time in 8 years. He was 31. He drove a car that was modest, deliberately so, a 4-door sedan with 112,000 miles on it that he had chosen specifically because he did not want to arrive in a car that announced itself. He sat in it for a moment at the curb in front of Cecile's house, looking at the cracked front step and the window that always stuck, and he breathed. He had not called ahead. He was not entirely sure why. There was something in him that needed to see the house first before he said anything to anyone. Cecile opened the door before he was halfway up the walk. She had been watching from behind the curtain, the way she always watched, the way the block's older residents always watched, not from suspicion, but from the long-formed habit of knowing what was happening on your street. She looked at him. He looked at her. She said, "Darius." He said, "Miss Cecile." She stepped back and he came in, and the kitchen was exactly as he remembered it. The same table, the same laminating machine on the counter, a box of pencils by the window, and he felt something move through him that he did not know the name of yet, but that had something to do with the smell of the room, the particular quality of the light, the sense that certain rooms hold the shape of what was done in them. They talked for 2 hours. Cecile made coffee and sliced a piece of pound cake she had baked that morning, and they talked the way people talk when time has passed and the gap must be bridged in conversation before anything else can happen. He told her about Cincinnati, about the finance firm, about the 6 years of work and the promotions and the partnerships and the moment, 4 years ago, when he had started his own fund with 2 colleagues, a small private equity operation that had, in the intervening years, done very well. Cecile listened the way she always listened, with her whole attention, her coffee cup held in both hands, her eyes on his face. He told her he had thought about her often. He told her about the afternoon, 15 years back, when he was sitting in a college accounting course and a professor had drawn a network diagram on the board, showing how a series of numbers were connected by underlying logic rather than surface similarity. And Darius had felt the back of his neck go warm because it was exactly what Cecile had been teaching him at her kitchen table at 14, the walking through of thinking, the pattern under the surface. "You gave me the thing that none of the school could give me," he said. "You gave me permission to think the way I actually think." Cecile set her coffee cup down. She looked at him, and her expression was the one she wore when something reached her, a composed softness, eyes a little bright, chin steady. "You did the thinking," she said. "I just gave you room to do it out loud." He left that afternoon, and she stood at the window and watched his car turn at the corner, and then she sat back down at the table where he had sat, where Devon had sat in 1993, where 200 and some children had sat over the years, and she was quiet for a long time. He came back 3 more times that year. Each time they talked longer. He brought her information without making it feel like information. He asked about her rent, and she told him, and he asked whether the property management company had ever offered her a lease-to-own option, and she said no, they had not, and he wrote nothing down in her presence, but she could see him making a note somewhere behind his eyes. She didn't ask what he was thinking. He did not tell her what he was doing. This is the part of the story where the two of them moved in parallel without coordinates. Cecile simply living the life she had always lived, and Darius doing what he had learned, without knowing he had learned it from her, to do. Assembling a pattern from its parts. In January of 2024, Darius contacted the property management company that owned the house at 417 Clement Street. The company was now in its 3rd incarnation, a mid-sized portfolio operation out of Columbus with 140 residential properties in 6 Ohio cities. He did not go to them as a neighbor. He went to them as an investor through a holding company he had incorporated in Delaware 3 months earlier for precisely this purpose, and the conversation he initiated was about a cluster of properties in Harlan, a package deal, 11 houses in total, 5 of which the company had been slowly trying to unload because the maintenance overhead was high and the cap rate was modest. The house at 417, Clement was in that cluster. It took 11 months. There were lawyers involved and title searches and an inspection that turned up the window that always stuck and the cracked front step and a slow leak under the second bathroom sink that Cecile had reported to the property management company in 2021, and they had not fixed. There were counteroffers and a period of silence from the seller's side, and then a renewed offer and a closing date in December of 2024. Darius paid for the house. He paid for the house and for the repairs, the step, the window, the leak, and a furnace that the inspection had identified as 9 years past its expected lifespan. He arranged for the deed to be placed in Cecile's name. He had one condition, which he had told no lawyer about. He wrote it in the letter himself, at his desk in his home in Cincinnati, 3 drafts before the 4th one felt right. The letter was not long. It said what it needed to say. It said that the house was hers, free and clear, and that he hoped the kitchen table would stay where it was for as long as she wanted it there, because it had shaped her life, and he knew that for a fact. The letter arrived on a Tuesday in November 2024 in a plain envelope with the Columbus return address of the title company. Cecile read it standing up. She read it once and then she set it down, and she picked up her coffee and took a slow sip of it, even though it had gone cold, and then she picked up the letter and read it again. She did not cry immediately. She was a woman who held things, who let them settle before they opened. She put the letter down on the kitchen table, on the same table that had been there since 1991, and she looked out the window at Clement Street, at the buckling sidewalk and the cracked shelter at the bus stop, and the oak tree where the idle boys had gathered on summer evenings, and something moved through her that was not surprise, because on some level she had never been fully surprised by goodness, only grateful for it in the specific and named way. She sat down. She pressed both palms flat on the table, and she sat there in the quiet kitchen, the November light coming in, thin and clear, and then she covered her face with her hands, and she wept. She called her daughter in Atlanta. She called her, and when her daughter picked up, Cecile said, "Baby, I have to tell you something." And her voice was steady, the voice of a woman who has held things, but her daughter heard the texture underneath it and said, "Mama, what happened? Are you all right?" And Cecile said, "I'm all right. I'm better than all right." And then she told her. Her daughter's name was Renee. Renee was 51, and she had watched her mother spend her life giving things away, and she had felt over the years both proud of it and quietly frightened by it, the fear that is the underside of love when the person you love is generous in a way that makes them vulnerable. She sat on the phone in her apartment in Atlanta and listened to her mother read the letter aloud, and by the time Cecile read the last line, Renee was not sitting anymore. She was standing in her kitchen, her hand pressed to her mouth, her eyes streaming. "I need you to tell me who he is," Renee said. Cecile said, "His name is Darius. He came to me when he was 14. He sat right here at this table." Darius drove up from Cincinnati on the Saturday after Thanksgiving. Cecile had made pound cake and a pot of greens and a pan of cornbread, and when he knocked on the door, she opened it and looked at him. This 36-year-old man, who had once been a 14-year-old boy, sitting across from her, not knowing that his thinking was already good, and she said, "Come in out of the cold." He came in. She hugged him. He was tall and she was not, and he bent to receive it, and she held on for a moment longer than necessary, and neither of them said anything during that moment. Renee was there, had driven up from Atlanta the day before, and she stood back and let it happen, and then she shook Darius's hand and said, "I've been wanting to say thank you to you." "I don't know that I have the right words," Darius said. "She made me who I am. This is the least a person can do." Renee looked at him for a moment, and then she nodded, the nod of someone receiving a true thing. They ate. They sat at the kitchen table, the three of them, and Cecile served the greens and the cornbread and sliced the pound cake, and they talked the way people talk when something large has happened, and the large thing is present in the room and must be honoured, but also must be lived with, because the people in the room still need to eat and speak and tell stories and be ordinary. Darius told them about the 11 months, about the lawyers and the title searches and the patience it required to do a thing through proper channels when impatience would have been easier. Cecile listened and nodded, and at one point said, "You learned that too," and he looked at her and said, "I know I did." He told her about the furnace. She had not known about the furnace, and she sat back in her chair and said, "I wondered why it seemed to be working harder this month." And he said, "You have a new one." And she shook her head slowly, not in refusal, but in the careful receiving of something large. He told her that the property management company still owned the other 10 houses in the cluster, and that his holding company retained an interest in the portfolio, which meant that if any other resident on Clement Street needed an advocate when a lease came up or a repair went too long unanswered, they had one. Cecile looked at him when he said this, looked at him with the full weight of her attention, and said, "You didn't have to do that." "No," he said, "I didn't." She understood the distinction. She had spent her life making that distinction, the one between what is required and what you choose. She received it quietly, with gratitude that did not need to perform itself. After dinner, Darius sat with Cecile in the living room while Renee did the dishes, and the house was warm, the new furnace running steady and even, and outside November was settling into the street, the oak tree bare now, the sidewalk lit by the corner light. Cecile said, "I want you to know something." He waited. She said, "I never once did any of it, thinking about a return. Not one day. I want you to know that because I don't want you to think I was investing in you children the way you invest in a thing. I just loved you. I love all of you. And I would have kept on loving you whether anything came back or not. Darius was quiet for a moment. Then he said, I know that. That's exactly why I did this. Because you weren't keeping score. You never kept score. And somebody needed to. Cecile looked at her hands in her lap for a moment. Then she looked up at him. You learned patience from me, she said. And you learned that too. What? He said. That somebody needed to. He nodded slowly. Outside, the November wind moved through the bare oak tree and the corner light held steady and the street was quiet. Does anyone in your life give the way she gave without keeping score and without expecting anything back? Tell us in the comments. We read everyone. The deed was filed on December 12th, 2024, and Cecile's name went into the public record as the owner of 417 Clement Street, Harlan, Ohio, for the first time in the 31 years she had lived there. She did not have a ceremony about it. She went on a Wednesday morning to the county recorder's office with Renee, who had stayed the week, and she handed over the documents and received the receipt and walked back out into the December cold with the receipt in her coat pocket, and Renee took her arm on the icy sidewalk and they walked together to the car. That afternoon, Cecile opened her door and a 10-year-old from 2 houses down came in with her backpack and sat at the kitchen table and asked for help with long division. Cecile put the kettle on and sat across from her and said, Walk me through what you've got so far. The girl showed her work. Cecile looked at it, and then she said, You're almost there. You're closer than you think. The box of pencils was on the table by the window where it always was. The laminating machine was on the counter. The table held its 4 corners steady on the floor where it had always held them, worn smooth at the edges by 31 years of elbows and open books and work being done. This is where it has always happened. And she was home. If this story moved you, there is another one waiting for you right here about a woman who kept a promise for 40 years when no one was watching, and what it cost her, and what it returned. The girl's name was Nadia, and she was the granddaughter of the woman who had lived in the house at the far end of the block before that woman moved to Cleveland to be near her son. Nadia and her mother had moved into the house 2 years ago, and Nadia's mother worked days at a distribution centre east of the city, which meant Nadia had the after-school hours to manage on her own. She was a quiet child, careful and watchful, and she had noticed Miss Cecile's door the way the children of Clement Street had been noticing it for 31 years, as something open when it could have been closed. She had knocked for the first time in October, and Cecile had opened the door and looked at her and said, Come in, baby, without knowing her name yet, because that was what you did. You opened the door and you said, Come in. Now it was December, and Nadia sat at the kitchen table working through long division, and the new furnace ran quietly behind the walls, and the kitchen was warm, and the pencil in Nadia's hand moved across the paper as she walked the problem from the beginning, the way Miss Cecile had taught her, one step at a time, showing her thinking rather than hiding it. There, Cecile said. You see it? Nadia looked at the paper. She looked at it again. And then something shifted in her face, the small opening that happens when a thing that was stuck comes unstuck, and she said, Oh, I see it. You always could, Cecile said. You just needed to slow down long enough to see it. This is the thing about teaching, the real thing, the thing that is easy to miss if you look only at the outcomes and not the work behind them. It is not about the transfer of information. It is about giving a child the experience of their own competence. It is about sitting across from them in the particular light of a kitchen in the afternoon and saying, with your attention and your time and your willingness to stay there, that they are capable, that they can figure this out, that they are not the thing the test said they were. Cecile had known this for 40 years. She had known it before she knew it, the way certain truths arrive in the body before they settle in the mind. She had walked into her first classroom at Harlan Elementary in 1981 at the age of 27, young and nervous, and still believing that curriculum was the thing, and within the first 3 weeks she had understood that curriculum was the vehicle and something else was the engine. The engine was relationship. The engine was seeing a child and meaning it. She had spent 43 years running that engine, first in the classroom, then at the kitchen table. The table had simply extended the classroom by 31 years and 200 and some children, and she had never thought of this as unusual because it was simply what she did, the way some people tend gardens and some people repair cars and some people sing in church. It was the form her life had taken. Darius had sat at this table in 2008, and he had come back in 2019, and he had come back 4 more times after that. And in between the visits, he had done a thing that would take most people years to believe was possible, which was to construct a gift so large and so legally specific that it could not be returned or refused, could not be softened by Cecile's habitual downplaying of her own needs. He had put her name on a deed. He had made her a homeowner. You could not return a deed. She had not tried to return it. She had received it the way she had learned to receive most things from her faith and from her life, and from the 43 years of watching children discover their own competence, with gratitude that acknowledged the gift without diminishing the giver, and with a deep settled sense that this was the world operating as it was supposed to operate, that kindness had in fact been keeping a ledger somewhere, that the patient and faithful thing had been seen. What she had not expected was how the house would feel different now. It did not look different. The cracked front step was repaired, but otherwise it was the same narrow 2-bedroom with the window that no longer stuck, the kitchen that smelled of coffee and pound cake, the worn table, the box of pencils. She had lived in every room of it for 31 years, and she knew it the way you know a body you have been comfortable in for a long time. Nothing about it had changed in a way you could see. What had changed was the quality of her belonging to it. She had always belonged to the house in the way that matters, which is use and love and daily presence. But now she belonged to it in the other way as well, the legal and formal and recorded way, and she found in the weeks after the letter arrived that this second way did something she had not anticipated. It made her feel for the first time in 31 years that she was not going to be asked to leave. She had not known she was carrying that particular weight. She had not named it, not to herself, not to Renee, not to anyone. It had been the unremarked background condition of 31 years of renting, the faint and unexamined knowledge that the house could be sold, the lease could end, the company could decide to do something else with the property, and she would be given her legally required notice and she would have to go. She had known this the way you know things that you cannot change, which is to say she had stopped knowing it consciously and it had sunk into the body instead. When the deed came, the weight lifted. She felt it go. She sat in her kitchen the morning after Darius's Thanksgiving visit, and she felt the room differently, felt her place in it differently, and it took her a while to understand what she was feeling. Then she understood. She was home. She had always been at home here, but now she was home in the other sense as well, the one that means you have ground under you, and the ground is yours, and no one is going to take it. She was 70 years old, and she was home for the first time. She made coffee. She looked out the window at Clement Street in the November morning, at the buckled sidewalk and the bare oak tree and the bus stop whose plastic wall was still cracked, and she thought about what Darius had said about the other 10 houses, about his holding company and the property management operation and the fact that someone was now paying attention to what happened on this block. She thought about that quietly. The way she thought about most things, turning it over without rushing it, feeling the weight of it settle. Then she got up and she put a box of pencils by the window because the box by the window was down to the last dozen, and she kept a spare in the hallway closet and she put it there so it was ready. The children would come this afternoon. They came every afternoon. Renee called that evening from Atlanta, where she had returned on Monday, and she asked how Cecile was doing, and Cecile said she was fine, more than fine, and Renee said, "I keep thinking about it, Mama. I keep thinking about all those kids and all those years and then this." Cecile said, "You know what I keep thinking about?" "What?" "I keep thinking about Darius at 14, sitting right here at this table, and how he held his pencil too hard. You could hear it, like he was afraid if he held it lighter, the answer would run away from him." She paused. "He doesn't hold his pencil like that anymore." Renee was quiet for a moment. "He grew up," she said. "He did," Cecile said, "and he carried what I gave him, and he did something with it that I couldn't have imagined. That's the deal, baby. You give it, and you let it go, and you don't know what it becomes. You just have to trust it becomes something." Renee said, "I love you, Mama." Cecile said, "I love you too. Now go to bed. It's late." She hung up and sat at the kitchen table in the quiet of the December evening, and the furnace ran its steady hum through the walls, and outside the street was dark and still. She reached out and laid her hand flat on the table and felt the worn smoothness of it under her palm. 31 years of afternoons gathered in the grain of it. She had no plans to stop. In the spring, when the weather turned and the afternoons went long and golden, she expected the traffic to pick up the way it always did, children gravitating toward an open door and a patient woman with a box of pencils when the light started staying past 5. She would put the box fan in the doorway between the kitchen and the living room and open the windows, and the air would move through the house, and the table would be there, and she would be there, and the work would be what it had always been. She was 70 years old, and the house was hers, and the door was open, and she was not done. The table held its 4 corners steady on the floor. Outside, December settled over Clement Street, and the corner light burned through the dark, and the oak tree stood bare and patient, waiting for what came next. She was home. The weeks after the deed arrived had their own texture, and Cecile noticed it the way she noticed most things, carefully and without fuss. People on the block learned what had happened. She had not announced it. She was not a woman who announced things. But Harlem was a small city, and Clement Street was a small block, and the way news moved there was the way water moves, finding its level through every available channel. Nadia's mother found out through a neighbour. The woman at the corner store found out through Nadia's mother. The man who shoveled snow for 3 houses in a row found out through the woman at the corner store, and he showed up at Cecile's door on a Saturday morning with his shovel and said, "I heard. I just want you to know I'm happy for you." And she thanked him, and he shoveled her walk without being asked, and did not charge her. And she watched him from the window and felt the web of it, the way a neighbourhood holds its people when the neighbourhood is working, when it is doing the thing neighbourhoods are supposed to do. Devon, the boy next door from 1993, was now a man of 40, living 3 blocks over, and his daughter was one of Cecile's current regulars. He knocked on her door on a Sunday in December and said he had heard and that he wanted her to know that he had passed his real estate license exam in September of the previous year, 10 months ago, and that he had been meaning to tell her. She said, "Come in and tell me all about it." And he did, and they sat at the table where he had sat at 9 years old, and she listened to him the way she had always listened, with her whole attention. And when he was done, she said, 30 years ago you couldn't get through a page. Now you're telling me about property law." Devon said, "You know whose fault that is." She said, "Go home to your family," but she was smiling when she said it. Marcus, Devon's cousin, who had come with Devon in those first weeks of 1993, and who had sat at the table through most of elementary school and part of middle school, lived now in Columbus. He had called the week after Thanksgiving, not having her number but getting it through his aunt, who still lived on Clement. And the call lasted 40 minutes, and at the end of it, he said, "I keep thinking about that table. Everything important I figured out at that table." Cecile said, "That's your doing, Marcus. I just had the table." He said, "No, Miss Cecile, you had more than the table." And she let him have that, because sometimes the generous thing is to let someone give you what they need to give. She pulled a piece of paper from the drawer beside the stove, the one where she kept odds and ends, rubber bands, spare batteries, a notepad. She wrote Devon's name. She wrote Marcus's name. She wrote Darius's name. She had not done this before, had not kept a record, but something in her wanted to mark it now, to make a small accounting of the ripple she could actually see, knowing it was only the edge of the thing. She wrote the names of 11 others she could think of from memory. The boy with the stutter, the girl who passed the 8th grade placement exam, the twins who came to her some mornings still in yesterday's clothes. She did not know all of their outcomes. She knew some of them. She knew that the girl who had passed the exam was now a nurse in Cincinnati, and she knew this because the girl had sent her a card years ago with her graduation photo and a note that said simply, "You told me I was a math person. I didn't believe you then. I believe you now." She kept the card in the drawer beside the stove. She knew that the twins had stayed in Harlan and that both of them were working, one at the hospital in the same dietary department where Darius's mother had worked, one driving a city bus. She knew their mother had moved to a better apartment and that she had gotten there in part because her boys had been able to help. She didn't know the full weight of what had moved through the 31 years. Nobody ever does. That is the nature of the thing. You give and you let it go, and somewhere downstream it does what it does, and you see only the pieces that find their way back to you. She folded the piece of paper and put it back in the drawer. Then she got up and washed the evening dishes. The way she had washed the dishes every evening for 31 years, standing at the kitchen sink with the window dark and the overhead light making the room a small, warm island in the December night, and the water ran warm over her hands, and the dishes were clean, and she dried them and stacked them in the cabinet and turned off the light. In the morning there would be coffee and the morning light coming in at the particular angle it came in December, low and thin and reaching all the way to the far wall, and there would be Nadia at the door after school, and whatever child came with her, and the work that was not work would begin again. Cecile had not set out to build anything. She had set out to open a door and keep it open. What got built was not something you could see all at once, only in the pieces that found their way back. A phone call from Columbus, a daughter who was a nurse, a boy from the porch who now knew property law, and a man who had held his pencil too hard at 14 and had grown up to put her name on a deed. Kindness remembers. Even when you don't keep score, something does. She was 70 years old, she was home, and the door was going to stay open as long as she had anything to say about it.